The communion is a refrain sung with psalm recitation during the distribution of the Eucharist in the Divine Liturgy at Mass. As chant, it was connected with the ritual act of Christian communion. The canonical cycle of the Divine Liturgy in Orthodox rites. According to Dimitri Konomos, the canonical, as it is sung as an elaborated communion chant during the Divine Liturgy, has derived from an early practice of psalm recitation similar to Western liturgies, when the canonical served as a troparion. The oldest troparion which was used for communion was gamma epsilon upsilon sigma alpha sigma theta epsilon kappa alpha delta epsilon tau epsilon. It was supposed to symbolize the Last Supper celebrated on Maundy Thursday. During the 5th century, when the Divine Liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts had established and this communion chant became associated with it, the custom spread over the Lenten period, presumably with the recitation of different psalm sections. In the early Asmatica, the choir book of the cathedral rite, this canonical is classified as echoes protos according to the modal signatures of the octoechos, but its archaic melos does not finish on the finalis and basis of this echoes, but with the one of echoes plagios deuteros. The canonical cycles of the Byzantine cathedral rite. In the cathedral rite of Constantinople, the canonical as a troparion became so elaborated that it was sung without psalm recitation. Nevertheless, its text was usually as stichos taken from the Psalter, like the Sunday canonical of the week cycle alpha nu epsilon tau nu kappa epsilon rho iota omicron nu, which had already added as an octoechos cycle in 13th century Greek Asmatica, so that they could be performed according to the echoes of the week. Despite the weekly cycle, which has not been more fixed than feasts dedicated to the Theotokos pi omicron tau eta rho iota omicron nu sigma omega tau eta rho iota omicron epsilon martyrs, the repertory of 26 canonica developed as a calendaric cycle of fixed and movable feasts during the 9th century, and they can be found in the books of the cathedral rite since the 12th century. Since the 14th century, when a mixed rite had replaced the former tradition of the cathedral rite at Hagia Sophia, the old models have been elaborated in compositions of the maestors like John Glickies, John Koukouzelis, and Manuel Chrysophers. Communion chant in Western Plain chant. The communio part of the Ambrosian Mass. The communion part of the Ambrosian Mass, as it had been celebrated in the cathedrals of Milan, was composed around the anaphora. It was opened by a litany called De Kyrie, the Paternoster, and the chant which preceded the post-communio was called Transitorium, the confractorium of the Gallican and Visigothic Mass. According to Isidore of Seville and Pseudo-Germanus's Expositio Antiquae Liturgiae Gallicanae, the communion chant of the Mass in the Gallican Rite of France and the Visigothic Rite of Spain was called confractorium and probably connected with the ritual breaking of sacramental bread. The communion cycle of the Roman and Roman Frankish Rite. According to James McKinnon, the communio became late part of Roman Mass, and like in many other Western sources, there is no early evidence of a Latin equivalent of the Ps. 33.9 as a kind of prototype of the genre, but Ordo Romanus the first describes the communion chant as an antiphon with psalms sung by the Schola Cantorum accompanying the distribution of the Eucharist, until the presiding pope interrupts it. Nevertheless, the genre communio became an important and favored subject in the process of a compositional planning of the Mass proper by the leader of the Schola Cantorum, which had already about 141 items during the 7th century. The dramaturgy in the composition of communion chants and the choice of scriptural texts from Advent to Epiphany includes the composition of an epic, recitation of prophetic texts before Christmas, while the later serial of communion chants use extracts from the Gospel readings of the day, composed in a rather dramatic style. Since the Carolingian reform, the Roman Mass proper became part of the Roman Frankish liturgy, and the most common musical settings of it were reserved for special masses such as Requiem Masses, where the chant has the incipit lux aeterna. In contemporary Catholic usage, the communion chant corresponds to the communion antiphon and is sung or recited audibly throughout by the faithful.